Okay, welcome back. This is lesson 4 in our 7-lesson unit on the Communist Manifesto. Today's lesson is all about revolutionary Marxism. Let's get started. First, we're going to examine a typology of social transformation to be better equipped to address the question, what is revolution? Then we look at Louis Blanquism, who was a contemporary of Marx's and who laid out a kind of extreme version of revolution that Marxists typically reject. So then we go into Marxism-Leninism and explore his theory of the state, Lenin's preconditions for revolution and how they differ from Marx's, which takes us to the idea of the permanent revolution and how that idea was expanded on by Trotsky. Then we talk about Lenin's theory of revolution, so we have to talk about the revolutionary vanguard and the cadre system. Finally, we explore Lenin's ideas about a worker state to replace the bourgeois state. This takes us to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the path to communism. Marx and Lenin had different ideas about the path to communism, so we explore those differences in this section. Finally, we talk about the 10-point plan in the manifesto, which lays out what Marx's suggestions were for the movement he was speaking directly to during the 1840s. Then, at the end, we'll address the question of how the Paris Commune impacted Marx's thought and how some of what he said in the manifesto needs to be contextualized in the light of this historical event, because it likely changed the way Marx was thinking from the time the manifesto was written in the 1840s to the 1870s when the Paris Commune happened. Okay, let's go. What are we talking about when we talk about revolution? The definition of revolutionary change that Rosa Luxemburg gives us in her classic text, Reform or Revolution, is that revolution is fundamental change between relations of production. In our world, that means changing from a capitalist mode of production to a socialist mode of production. This is contrasted to reforms, which do not fundamentally change the relations of production, but merely improve things within capitalism. Luxemburg teaches us that the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. I take this to mean raising consciousness around our political economic situation is a precondition for successful revolutionary transformation. And so to introduce this subject, I think it's important to see ourselves in this course as engaged in revolutionary activity insofar as educating ourselves is a key component in productive transformation, at least according to Rosa. Okay, we've established in the broadest possible terms that revolution for us means the transformation from capitalism to some kind of socialism. For many of us, we associate revolution with the violent overthrow of the state, but the analytical Marxist sociologist Eric Olin Wright offers a framework in his book envisioning real utopias for 3 different strategies for revolution understood as any kind of transformation that gets us away from capitalism and into socialism. Violent revolution is one, and it fits in the ruptural category. Ruptural transformations imply the creation of new institutions of social empowerment through a sharp break within existing institutions and social structures. The central idea here is that through direct confrontation and political struggles, it is possible to create a radical disjuncture in institutional structures in which existing institutions are destroyed and new ones are built up in a fairly rapid way. Violent revolutions are one way this can happen, but in theory they need not be violent. In fact, the quintessential October Revolution in Russia was nearly a bloodless revolution, but also ruptural changes could take the form of any rapid and significant shifts in power or ownership structures. To quote Wright, he says this is basically smash first, build second. Alright, now let's introduce interstitial strategies for transformation. Interstitial strategies build new forms of social empowerment in the niches and margins of capitalist society. Examples include worker and consumer co-ops, women's shelters, workers' factory councils, intentional communes and communities, civic environmental councils, community-controlled land trusts, cross-border equal exchange trade organizations. The Soviets in Russia are an example. Soviets just means worker councils, so the list really goes on here. They bypass the state, working in the interstices or cracks of the capitalist system. Critics sometimes say interstitial strategies don't pose a threat to the system because they are only there because they are allowed by the system. Or worse yet, they rely on capitalism in the way that an intentional community may still pay taxes or buy capitalist goods. Interstitial advocates might respond that we are experimenting and building the blueprint for what an emancipated society will eventually look like. Additionally, the more interstitial spaces there are, the more they could support a ruptural transformation or even pave the way toward a non-violent transformation from capitalism, the evolutionary rather than revolutionary path, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. Critics might also say that interstitial projects like hippie communes are little more than a retreat for a privileged few to disengage from political struggle. While I have personal experience of communities like this, I think it's important to recognize that not all interstitial projects disengage, and as a whole, they are crucial areas to build on and encourage. The third form of transformation is termed symbiotic. Symbiotic strategies are about the labor movement, like unions, worker councils, and labor parties working within capitalism, working within the ongoing class war. They do this to make deals with the capitalist class that benefit both parties, but end up with the labor movement in a strategically superior position. For example, the fight to ensure the legal right to strike, or raising the minimum wage, or opening possibilities for better community organization or democratic representation. These things not only help the lives of the mass of people, they take power away from capitalists, and they may open opportunities for both ruptural and interstitial strategies. Let's go one level deeper. Here we have table 8.1 from Wright's book, Envisioning Real Utopias. You can see the three visions or trajectories for systematic transformation beyond capitalism there on the left: ruptural, interstitial, and symbiotic. Ruptural transformations are most closely associated with the revolutionary socialist or communist tradition, though many anarchists have advocated ruptural change as well. They think the main transformative actors are classes organized into parties, specifically the Communist Party. They then use that organization to attack the state and take power. They use that power to confront the bourgeoisie and forcibly end capitalism. The guiding metaphor here is war. We'll talk a lot more about this strategy in a moment. All we're doing now is situating it along other trajectories for social transformation. Interstitial transformations are most forcefully advocated by the anarchists. Their pivotal social actors are social movements, which are heterogeneous sets of constituencies, interests, and identities, likely without any one of them being the leader. They build emancipated spaces in the cracks of existing society and do everything they can to avoid dealing with the state, and especially avoid the state coming and shutting down their legal or illegal communes. They also ignore the bourgeoisie. They challenge capitalism by building a better alternative. To that end, their guiding metaphor is ecological competition, in which one kind of organism, like the worker-owned cooperative, gains a foothold and then eventually outcompetes its rival, like the capitalist organization. Okay, let's move on to talk about symbiotic metamorphosis. Social democrats are largely the ones spearheading the symbiotic strategy. They use popular coalitions like the labor movement in order to wage the class war, basically, often using the state as a tool to build social power and enforce legal rights and so on. They collaborate with the bourgeoisie. They seek to find areas of class compromise or positive collaboration which may involve confrontations. The guiding metaphor here is evolutionary adaptations, in the sense that structural properties are modified through adaptations which progressively enhance social power and eventually result in a new species. So how do we know which vision for revolutionary transformation is the way? Well, Wright basically tells us that we need to work on all three levels. Let's read. It often happens that activists become deeply committed to one or another of these strategic visions, seeing them as being universally valid. As a result, considerable energy is expended in fighting against the rejected strategic models. A long-term political project of emancipatory transformation with any prospect for success must grapple with the messy problem of combining different elements of these strategies, even though on the ground it's often the case that they work at cross purposes. I explain all of this here for two reasons. One, to differentiate between revolution and ruptural changes. They are compatible but conceptually distinct. Two, to illustrate right off the bat a pluralist approach to revolution before we dive into the Leninist approach to revolution, which emphasizes ruptural change over all others. A major figure in revolutionary socialism is Louis-Auguste Blanquism. Let's read from Andrew Haywood's text that spells out the difference between Marx and Blanquism quite clearly. One of the earliest advocates of revolution was the French socialist Auguste Blanquism, who proposed the formation of a small band of dedicated conspirators to plan and carry out a revolutionary seizure of power. Marx and Engels, on the other hand, envisioned a proletarian revolution in which the class-conscious working masses would rise up and overthrow capitalism. Blanquism believed that socialist revolution should be carried out by a relatively small group of highly organized and secretive conspirators. Having seized power, the revolutionaries would then use the power of the state to introduce socialism. It's considered a particular sort of putschism, that is, the view that political revolution should take the form of a putsch or a coup d'etat. So he didn't believe in or highlight the revolutionary force and necessity of the proletariat. He believed that revolution should be carried out by a small group of professional, dedicated revolutionaries who would establish a temporary dictatorship by force. This is not a dictatorship of the proletariat, it's a dictatorship of professional revolutionaries who have socialist values. This has been critiqued by Marxists as a form of substitutionism. Paul D'Amato defines substitutionism this way. In Marxist terms, any group, class, or party that substitutes its own activity for that of the class it claims to emancipate, that acts as a proxy in the name of and on behalf of the working class and the oppressed, is substitutionist. This takes us directly to the distinction between political and economic revolution, which is key for our discussion. Political revolution refers to the overthrow of the bourgeois state, seizing political power somehow. Economic revolution refers to the transition between modes of production. For Marxists, the aim of political revolution is economic revolution. For Blanquists, revolutionary elites force an immediate political revolution with vague aspirations for top-down institutionalization of economic revolution afterwards. Engels criticized Blanquism, saying Blanquism is essentially a political revolutionist. He is a socialist only through sentiment, through his sympathy with the sufferings of the people, but he has neither a socialist theory nor any definite practical suggestions for social remedies. Basically, Blanquism has no real plan for economic revolution. Enter Lenin. It's beyond the scope of this lesson to go into detail about the actual history of Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution. Here what we're doing is just giving broad outlines of the Marxist-Leninist theory of revolution, but first let's introduce Vladimir Lenin. He played a leading role in the October Revolution of 1917, overthrowing the provisional government, which was a bourgeois state that was established after the Russian monarchy was dismantled by an earlier revolution. Lenin's Bolshevik party succeeded in taking power and established a one-party state under the new Communist Party that became the Soviet Union, which endured the reign of Stalin. My approach to this section is basically to clarify the arguments he makes in State and Revolution, which he wrote in exile before the revolution, and is definitely worth reading, if for no other reason than because it has had such a great impact on third world revolutions around the globe. The argument goes as follows. First, he defines the state, which we have already done in the last lesson. Then he describes the preconditions of revolution and the process of revolution. Then he talks about the worker state, also known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. And finally, he talks about the withering away of the state and the transition to a full communist society. We've already talked about Marx's theory of the state in this unit. Here I just want to draw out one part of it that's central to Leninism. This is the idea that classes have opposing interests. The state must take action on one side or the other. The bourgeois state oppresses the poor and working majority in favor of the capitalist class. So the workers' state inverts this dynamic and uses the power of centralization to suppress the likelihood of counter-revolution from the capitalist class, who would surely be embittered about losing power. This reversal is the immediate goal of revolution. He writes, "The state is a special organization of force. It is an organization of violence for the suppression of some class. What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, the exploiting one, that is, the bourgeoisie." Okay, let's do some textual hiking. In What is to be Done, Lenin writes, "Everyone agrees that it is necessary to develop the political consciousness of the working class. The question is how that is to be done and what is required to do it. The economic struggle merely impels the workers to realize the government's attitude towards the working class. Consequently, however much we may try to lend the economic struggle itself a political character, we shall never be able to develop the political consciousness of the workers to the level of social democratic political consciousness by keeping within the framework of the economic struggle, for that framework is too narrow. Class political consciousness can be brought to the workers only from without, that is, only from outside the economic struggle, from outside the sphere of relations between workers and employers." Translation: class struggle within capitalism is not enough for emancipation. What is needed is a communist political party to bring down capitalism itself. This means we can't go straight to an economic revolution. We need to wage a political revolution first, then revolutionize the economy from the top down. Let's continue our textual hiking about the importance of a communist party. Of all the organizations created by the working class, only a political party can give proper expression to the basic interests of the working class and lead it to complete victory. With the aid of trade unions, mutual aid societies, and other similar organizations alone, the workers will never be able to put an end to capitalism and build a socialist society. For this, the workers need an organization of a higher type. An organization that does not confine itself to the struggle for the satisfaction of the current needs of the working people, but aims at bringing the working class to power in order to effect a revolutionary transformation of society. Such an organization is the Communist Party. Okay, translation: Leninism claims we must look beyond symbiotic transformational strategies to ruptural strategies spearheaded by the Communist Party. Okay, let's take a step back and compare this to Marx. Marx's preconditions for revolution involve three things. One, the development of the productive forces. Dialectical materialism sees the evolution of technology as a major driver of history, though not the only one. The second is the immiseration of the workers. The more capitalism makes people suffer, the greater the desire for transformation. In the unit on the German ideology, we discussed how and where Marx lays this out. He describes this by talking about the increasing propertylessness of the masses. The third precondition is the organization of these immiserated masses into a coherent majority, an organized group, especially an organized class. Sina Talachian writes, according to Marx's materialist method of analysis, there were two kinds of conditions involved in allowing for a transition to communism: the objective and the subjective. The objective conditions refer to factors related to the material environment, primarily the economic, which were considered a necessary but not sufficient condition for a communist transition. In order for such a transition to be effected, the subjective condition, which develops out of and is dialectically related to the objective, also had to be present. This subjective factor refers to the state of the class struggle, which at an advanced stage involves the existence of a workers' movement, indicating the presence of a high degree of class consciousness among the proletariat, the universal agent of revolutionary transformation. So the development of the productive forces are the objective condition which is necessary but not sufficient for revolution. What's going to tip us over the revolutionary edge is the subjective factors regarding the people's feelings about capitalism and their organization. Not just feelings, but also what they know about the system. All three are necessary and sufficient conditions for revolution, at least for Marx. But Lenin was interested in how he could make a revolution in an economically backward or underdeveloped place like Russia at that time. For this reason, Lenin only had one precondition for revolution: the organization of the people into a communist party. Let's read from the Leninist textbook. Reality itself has disproved the opportunist dogma that a socialist revolution could begin only in those countries where the productive forces have reached the highest level and the working class constitutes the majority of the population. So in Leninism, there's a de-emphasis on the necessity of the development of the productive forces. Concerning Marx's condition that the workers must be immiserated, or as Marx puts it in the German ideology, propertyless, Lenin just takes this as a given. By arguing that all that was needed for a revolution was a cohesive labor movement organized in a communist party, Lenin knew that he was diverging from other strands of Marxism that emphasized the importance of developing the forces of production. This is where the idea of permanent revolution comes in. Remember, in the first unit on Marx's biography, we talked about Marx's 1850 address to the Communist League, where he proposes a strategy for workers to follow when A, the productive forces are undeveloped, or B, the bourgeoisie hasn't taken power. So if we're revolting against a monarchy, for example, like how Lenin was revolting against a monarchy or a provisional government that was set up by a monarchy. Or C, the bourgeois revolution is ongoing, but the capitalists haven't had enough time to consolidate state power very effectively. In all these cases, Marx says communists should expand and deepen revolutionary violence, run their own candidates, and try to raise taxes on the rich to tax them out of existence. Also, nationalizing key industries to take them out of capital's hands and put them into the whole community's control is really important. Basically, the workers should do everything they can to not let the bourgeoisie consolidate power in their own state. If we let that happen, then we'll be dealing with the epic challenge of modern bourgeois states like the USA and the UK, and so on. Of course, all of this is in addition to the organization and education of the workers, always. So Marx advocates permanent revolution in the 1850s. He writes, "Workers cannot come to power and achieve the realization of their class interests without passing through a protracted revolutionary development, but they themselves must contribute most to their final victory by informing themselves of their own class interests, by taking up their independent political position as soon as possible, by not allowing themselves to be misled by the hypocritical phrases of the democratic petty bourgeoisie into doubting for 1 minute the necessity of an independently organized party of the proletariat. Their battle cry must be the permanent revolution." Enter Leon Trotsky, a contemporary of Lenin's and a friend. He takes this idea of permanent revolution and applies it to the Russian situation around 1905. Like Marx, Trotsky's permanent revolution is an explanation of how socialist revolutions could occur in societies that have not achieved advanced capitalism. And it was rooted in the Marxist understanding that capitalism is a global phenomenon, so its overthrow must also be global. Crucially, Trotskyism is based on the conviction that the transition from feudalism to socialism does not need to pass through a capitalist phase. This position contradicts some parts of Marx's writings considered orthodox Marxism. In the 1850 address, Marx advocates permanent revolution as the proletarian strategy of maintaining organizational independence along class lines and a consistently militant series of political demands and tactics. He believed that the capitalists would advance production and the left should fight them to make sure they never consolidated power into huge bureaucracies like we have today. In general, though, there are some exceptions, and we'll talk about them in the next lesson. Marx envisions the transition to socialism going through capitalism and a bourgeois state. Trotsky forcefully argues that it is possible for a country to pass directly from the dominance of the semi-feudal aristocrats to the dominance of the working class, without an interceding period of dominance by the bourgeoisie. Marx's statements in his March 1850 address explicitly contradict such a view, assuming a period of petty bourgeois predominance over the classes which have been overthrown and over the proletariat. But Trotsky addresses this in his book, The History of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky argues that this period was close enough to the shortened period between February and October 1917. So Trotsky argued that workers, not the bourgeoisie, need to take power now and develop productive forces in a revolutionary government. He said the proletarian revolution in Russia would rely on proletarian revolutions in countries that were developed, like France, Germany, and Britain. He believed the proletarian revolution in Russia would not survive without international support because of their economic backwardness and international hostility. But he thought a proletarian revolution in Russia would spark the revolutions in Europe that were needed for Russia to transition fully into socialism. There's a good argument that Trotsky's views have since been vindicated. Trotsky's hopes for a pan-European revolution did not play out as quickly or as successfully as he hoped. The idea that the Russian Revolution needed to be part of a broader international revolution was a central tenet of Bolshevik strategy. The Bolsheviks, including Lenin and Trotsky, expected revolutions in Germany and other European countries to follow shortly after 1917. Although uprisings and revolutionary movements did occur, for example, in Germany in 1918 to 1919, Hungary in 1919, they were all ultimately suppressed, and the failure of these revolutions led to the isolation and downfall of Soviet Russia, validating Trotsky's view that the success of socialism in one country was contingent on the spread of revolution internationally. Thus, in Trotsky's view, the Russian Revolution, to be permanently successful, would have to depend on revolutions in other countries, particularly in Western Europe. This idea is directly opposed to the strategy implemented by Stalin when he took power. His idea was socialism in one country. Stalin declared that Russia needed to develop economically before a world revolution, and this way Russia could act as a model. The focus was on the development inside of Russia. How? Through strict centralization, lack of democracy and civil rights, and suppression of any opposition to the one-party rule which Lenin spearheaded before him. The legacy of this idea is pretty horrific. Yes, Russia industrialized faster than any economy at that time, but at the cost of famine and severe repression and purges. He was a totalitarian dictator. This takes us to the division between the two main factions of the Russian Social Democratic Party. It was on the question of the liberals. Both the Bolsheviks, which was the party of Lenin and Trotsky, and the Mensheviks, who eventually were beaten out by the Bolsheviks, agreed that the Russian Revolution in 1905 was bourgeois and liberal. The aims of that revolution was to overthrow the monarchy, install a bourgeois democracy, and give land to the peasants. Before 1917, Lenin supported the two-stage theory that Trotsky never did. The two-stage theory being the idea that we need a bourgeois stage before a worker revolution. The Mensheviks, which translates to the minority party of the Russian Social Democratic Party, believed a bourgeois revolution was necessary before a socialist revolution. Therefore, workers should not take power now. The bourgeoisie will develop capitalism and democracy for us. Now we turn to the Bolsheviks. By 1917, Lenin changed his mind and agreed with Trotsky that Russia needed an immediate revolution with peasants and workers. But we can only make Russia truly socialist if the German and French workers take power first. So he wanted a worker-peasant revolution in Russia as a trigger for a broader pan-European or even global revolution. Then we can all work towards socialism together. That was the plan. So the third phase of Lenin's theory concerns revolution. The first goal of the revolution is to conquer state power. In the manifesto, Marx writes, "The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy." The Bolsheviks actually succeeded in this first part, taking power in Russia. How was this done? To the Bolsheviks, winning the battle of democracy didn't mean winning an election. This meant violently overthrowing the rule of the bourgeoisie who controlled the state. Marx writes, "In describing the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we traced the more or less veiled civil war, that is, class war, within existing society up to the point where it turns into open revolution, and where the proletariat establishes its rule through the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie." And if it's unclear if the capitalists are really in power or if it was a monarchy, it doesn't matter too much. The revolution can be about overthrowing them as well. Okay, how are we supposed to wage a revolution against a Russian monarchy or democracy that's over half a millennia old and very powerful? At this time, the monarchy was about 500 years old, but its parliament had been established in 1905, only 12 years beforehand. It was called the Duma, and it wasn't exactly working too well. In any case, Lenin's answer concerns the vanguard. Who were the vanguard? Lenin writes, "The members of the party are they who accept the principles of the party program and render the party all possible support." In this sense, the vanguard is basically anyone in the Communist Party. But there's another sense in which the vanguard is used. In his speech on the agrarian question, he also said that the vanguard is the party that represents a whole class, the working class, and its duty is to lead the masses, not simply represent whatever level they are at. So in this sense, the vanguard is over and above the working class and acts as its leader. This is the sense in which the vanguard are elite revolutionaries within the party, the vanguard of the vanguard. It was intended to be a highly centralized body composed of experienced professional revolutionaries. They were the ideological and strategic leaders of the party and the working class. What was their purpose? They aimed to educate workers and form class consciousness. They wanted to create more revolutionaries and eventually take revolutionary action, and Lenin succeeded in doing all of this amazingly. That's why it's such a big deal in history. How does this link to Marxism? In some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. Let's see how it does. Marx writes, "The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat." So, in a highly centralized way, the vanguard works toward this end. The goal is the same as the manifesto suggests. The method of centralization is debatable whether that's exactly in Marx, as we'll see in this lesson. In any case, Lenin writes, "By educating the workers' party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, which is capable of assuming power and of leading the whole people to socialism, of directing and organizing the new order, of being the teacher, the guide, the leader of all the laboring and exploited people in the task of constructing their social life without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie." There you have it. High degree of centralization working toward basically Marxist aims. Let's get into the debate around the vanguard. Leninist defenders say the vanguard is necessary for the success of the revolution. The working class is not capable of carrying out the revolution on its own, and that a dedicated group of professional revolutionaries is necessary to lead the way. They also argue that the vanguard party is accountable to the working class and that it is more democratic than other forms of government. And there's a lot to be said about this. Defenders have a point, since two of the major successful socialist revolutions had vanguards, the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese Revolution under Mao, so no one can deny that it's effective at seizing power. And while it may not be democratic in a liberal sense, there is an argument that it's democratic in the sense that it's about achieving equality and it's about the people's power. In those more traditional senses of democracy, there's a real argument that we shouldn't dismiss that this was a democratic organization, a democratic movement in some real senses, although we need to look at the problems and ways in which it wasn't as well. Okay, so let's talk about the critics. The critics say that in practice it's undemocratic and that it concentrates too much power in the hands of a small group of people. They say the vanguard is more interested in maintaining its own power than in carrying out the will of the working class. In this way, it's likely to become corrupt and authoritarian, and that it is not accountable to the working class. How does history look back on the vanguard? The impetus for having a vanguard party was used by the Bolsheviks to justify their suppression of other parties. Their rationale was that since they were the vanguard of the proletariat, their right to rule could not be legitimately questioned. Hence, opposition parties could not be permitted to exist. Before 1917, the idea of the vanguard was compatible with multiple parties. After the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, in 1921, Lenin was still alive, the party outlawed opposition parties and formalized single-party rule. Stalin then comes to power and eliminates democratic accountability entirely. So, yeah, not a great legacy here, but I want to again emphasize that just because a country has one party rule doesn't mean that they're undemocratic. There are other senses in which we can talk about democracy that focus on the traditional meaning of the term, involving equality, and it's about sharing wealth. So in these senses it was democratic, in other senses not so much. Despite these critiques, this doesn't mean there are no organizational lessons to be learned from the Russian Revolution. The Vanguard Party used something called a cadre system of organizing. Let's read from Vivek Chibber. The Second International's cadre-based model has been so successful that every major mobilizational party of the 20th century replicated it to some extent, even on the right. Given that history, it's hard to imagine a way for the left to organize itself as a real force without some variant of the party structure the early socialists hit upon, a mass, cadre-based party with a centralized leadership and internal coherence. Parties on the left are not just vote-gathering machines, they are fundamentally instruments to organize and mobilize working people around their interests. This requires the parties to also be ideologically coherent, to have the ability to reach into working class communities and workplaces, to have an organic connection to the latter, and to transmit workers' demands and needs to the party so that they might be articulated into a coherent program. That program, then, is constantly reviewed, revised, and streamlined so that it is an evolving expression of class interests. Running candidates on a platform consistent with those interests is, of course, important, but the electoral campaigns are just one element of the tasks undertaken by these parties. Okay, so the vanguard party of Russian communist elites guiding the working class kind of led to disaster, but its organization was extremely effective at seizing power and maintaining power, as it was in China. Eric Hobsbawm writes, Lenin's vanguard party of Marxist cadres, disciplined and ideally full-time, his professional revolutionaries, was the most formidable political invention of the 20th century. This leads me to the question, given the efficacy of the cadre system, which Che Guevara called the backbone of the revolution, how can we use it and stay connected to the working class? I think that's a fair question. Let's do some more textual hiking. In most every case, it has been by implanting the party physically in the workplaces and neighborhoods of the working class, having full-time paid functionaries who are ideologically committed to the party program, and then recruiting members of the working class who have a proven ability to organize around the program and contribute to its development. These cadre have been a key component of these parties' success, as has some degree of centralization of functions, which of course are enlivened by democratic accountability. These general principles of party organization have been essential to the success of working class parties, whether in the communist guise or the reformist social democratic one. Now, maybe that will change. Maybe we will come up with organizational forms that are thoroughly decentralized, more diffuse and ideologically plural, yet which also manage to get things done. But we haven't yet seen one. And given the experience we have, we don't really have a basis to reject the most successful model of the past 100 years. If you're anything like me, you might have been thinking about the possible overlap between vanguardism and Blanquism. I'm not alone. Rosa Luxemburg noticed that Lenin shared similarities with Blanqui. For example, that the only precondition for revolution is an organization willing and able to go through with it. Marx writes, "It's self-evident that these conspirators do not limit themselves to the mere task of organizing the proletariat. Not at all. Their business lies precisely in trying to preempt the developing revolutionary process, to drive it artificially to crisis, to create a revolution ex nihilo, to make a revolution without the conditions of a revolution. For them, the only necessary condition for a revolution is an adequate organization of their conspiracy. They are the alchemists of the revolution, and they share all the woolly-mindedness, follies, and idées fixes of the former alchemists." So let's take this critique seriously and give it the full treatment by identifying the similarities and differences between Lenin and Blanqui, because Lenin himself rejected the accusation leveled at him that his Bolshevism was Blanquism. We know that Blanqui wanted revolutionary elite acts alone to overthrow the state, with the strategy of isolated coups or conspiracies without much attention to economic conditions, and he didn't have detailed post-revolution plans. Both Lenin and Blanqui emphasized the importance of a small, tightly organized group of professional revolutionaries leading a revolution. They both believed revolution will be a violent insurrection, and they both distrusted the workers to organize themselves. However, Lenin departed from Blanqui in critical ways. For Lenin, the vanguard party leads, educates, and organizes the working class. No such organization or engagement with the working class was necessary for Blanqui. Lenin's strategy was mass mobilization and organization in addition to organized professional revolutionaries, and he did have a post-revolution plan, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which we'll explore in detail in just a moment. Finally, let's examine the fourth aspect of Lenin's revolutionary theory, which concerns the worker state. Marx writes, "It's the task of the really revolutionary party to carry through the strictest centralization." As we'll see later, Marx walks this statement back significantly for good reasons, but it was really central to Leninism. This is obviously connected to the idea of democratic centralism, which is key in Marxism-Leninism, and we need to familiarize ourselves with it. Lenin writes, "The proletariat needs state power, the centralized organization of force, the organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, the semi-proletarians, in the work of establishing a socialist economy." In another place, he says, "Absolute centralization and the strictest discipline of the proletariat constitute one of the fundamental conditions for victory over the bourgeoisie." Okay, if you have an anarchist bone in your body, our ears should be pricking up right now, and our libertarian hackles should be raised whenever we talk about centralization. But in the meaning of Marxism, Paul D'Amato explains that some degree of centralism is basically critical for getting anything done. In this way, he echoes Chibber's statements from before about the cadre centralization. He writes, "The dreaded phrase democratic centralism was one whose meaning should be clear to anyone in any democratically run activist organization that is attempting to implement a decision. First debate, then vote, and then act in unison to put that decision into effect. Once debate is had, a decision must be made that the collective is disciplined enough to act on. That is the centralism part of democratic centralism." I think this statement glosses over key parts of centralization and how it's different from decentralization. In decentralization, the same thing happens, but if the members don't like the decision, they are free not to participate, and that's not really so in centralization. In any case, Lenin gets around this idea by writing, "The success of mass actions requires the conscious and voluntary participation of every individual worker. A strike cannot be conducted with the necessary solidarity. Voting at elections will not be conducted intelligently unless every worker consciously and voluntarily decides for himself the question to strike or not to strike." So he's saying universal submission to the cause is really key. We need to enforce rules from the top down, because if some people don't strike or boycott, then the whole thing is blown. So if everyone doesn't consent to an action universally, they must still be made to fall in line. That's the argument. Nonetheless, the Marxist-Leninist textbook wants to remind us that this is basically how most democracies work. They are, by and large, centralized organizations. Let's read. "The common will of the party cannot be created otherwise than democratically, that is, jointly, collectively, by comparing the different opinions and proposals and then adopting decisions binding for all. The common will thus elaborated has the advantage that it gives the fullest and therefore truest expression to the objective needs of the class struggle of the proletariat. Thus, the centralism of the Communist Party is a democratic centralism. That is, it is based on the will of the broadest membership of the party." To review, in practice, democratic centralism means 1. All the leading party bodies from top to bottom are elected. 2. Regular accounts are rendered by party bodies to their party organizations. 3. Strict party discipline and subordination of the minority to the majority. 4. Decisions of the higher bodies are absolutely obligatory on all lower bodies. There's a debate within Marxism about his sparing use of the term the dictatorship of the proletariat. The first thing to know is that dictatorships didn't mean the same thing that they do now that the world has experienced the authoritarian horrors of the last century. According to Hal Draper, who has done the most exhaustive study of this term in his book, Marx and Engels used this term as a likely reference to Roman times, when for 300 years, during times of emergency, Romans would elect a dictator for 6 months to sort things out. He would have limited powers, no ability to change the constitution or laws, and no right of access to the treasury. And after the 6-month term, he would be accountable to the public for any crimes he may have committed. This legal procedure has a particularly bad name, since the last dictator was Julius Caesar, who appointed himself dictator for life and ended up needing to be assassinated. We can assume Lenin was operating under the logic that if the state is taken over by the proletariat, and the assumption is that the proletariat's interests are aligned, then we don't need to bother allowing for a plurality of voices. Here we can see how the term dictatorship of the proletariat is fraught with a kind of deafening silence, which could suggest to us that Marx didn't mean it as a central term in his thought. It was Lenin who really capitalized on it as a part of his revolutionary strategy. Lenin was all about consolidating power, so this makes sense. In any case, Marx did use it, and so holds some responsibility for the silence that Carolee Bengelsdorf describes in her great study of Cuba and socialism. She writes, "The first, and in the end the most damaging of these silences, has to do with the absence of consideration of the need for effective autonomous institutional forums which might serve as counterbalances to forces or groups seeking domination and might challenge the entrenchment and durability of such groups' power." So the problem with the dictatorship of the proletariat understood as one-party rule, and I don't personally think it has to mean one-party rule, is that there are no checks and balances, and that makes it vulnerable to authoritarianism, which is precisely what happened. Okay, I'd like to do a little bit of textual hiking to explain the difference between the way Marx and Lenin used the term dictatorship. Within the Russian revolutionary movement, there appeared early on a very different context within which the term dictatorship began to be used. Faced with the non-existence of a revolutionary bourgeoisie, let alone a revolutionary proletariat, Russian revolutionaries were confronted from very early on with the fact that the great masses, the peasants, were the mainstay of czarist autocracy, and the populist attempts at mobilizing them turned out to be failures. It is for this reason that the revolutionary movement in Russia began to develop a theory of revolutionary dictatorship, because it became clear that there was no chance in Russian conditions for a popular revolution ever to become successful. In Russia, because of its social structure and due to the lack of a wide popular base among the majority of the population, the revolutionary movement became elitist, authoritarian, and dictatorial. It is within this very distinct Russian context that the Marxian statements about the dictatorship of the proletariat were taken up by Russian Marxists and imbued with a very different meaning. For it was in the Russian social democratic movement that the term dictatorship of the proletariat lost its analytical meaning, signifying that every form of class government is dictatorial, and acquired an ideological connotation, pointing to the way and method in which the revolution will be carried out. This is how a term that was marginal in Marx became central in Lenin, and this historical background is necessary to understand that one cannot read dictatorship of the proletariat in the few places where it appears in Marx and attribute to it the meaning it has in Lenin or in the platform of the various Russian revolutionary socialist groups. Okay, finally we can go deeper into the differences between Marxism and Leninism and the way in which this relates to the central concepts of capitalism, the proletarian dictatorship, socialism, and communism. Our starting point for the moment is capitalism, characterized by markets, a state, and classes, specifically employees and employers. For Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a transitional period between capitalism and what he calls the lower phase of communism. The dictatorship of the proletariat both preserves and transcends capitalism in key ways. Take a look at this quote from Marx about this. What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. So each new phase dialectically moves on, but it moves on from the previous stage. Marx is all about working with and from what has been transmitted to us from the past. So the proletarian dictatorship keeps markets, it keeps capital, it keeps the state, although the state is now dictated or controlled by an association of producers, not the capitalist class. But there is still a capitalist class, and the primary goal of the proletarian dictatorship is to democratize production and in so doing end the capitalist class and class struggle in general. So the classes at this stage are really the target of this period. At the same time, a key part of this period is the recognition that the capitalist classes are going to put up a fight. So fighting off any capitalist counter-revolution is really going to be key at this stage. Both Marx and Lenin knew this. In Marx's famous and essential work, The Critique of the Gotha Programme, where this quote is from, he criticizes the German Social Democratic Party and lays out his vision for a likely transition to a higher phase, or what we can call full communism. I think it's important to see this as a historical document that's talking about strategy at a given time and place, and is in that way very situated. It's not timeless, so we can draw from its lessons, but not worship it as if it applies to all situations and all times. But we really do need to know this because it has a lot to teach us. So here he talks about the first phase of communism, which is the end goal of the proletarian dictatorship phase. In lower phase communism, there are still markets. Yes, communism is compatible with markets. But the capitalist class has been abolished. Production has been democratized such that the workers own the mills, the farms, the factories, and they work for themselves, not any bosses. They are their own bosses because there are no classes. There is no class exploitation. Because of the abolition of classes, there is no state, because we should remember the state is defined by Marx as the instrument of class oppression. If there's no classes, there's no need for a state. However, Marx is ambiguous here about whether there will be any centralization at all. It could be that production is democratized in the sense of a centralized, nationalized, planned economy, or whether it's decentralized in a network of syndicated worker-owned cooperatives, or some version of both, right? A mixed economy, but two different kinds of democracy in the economy. In any case, what is clear is that Marx envisions the end of capital and our form of money as well. Instead, what functions as money in the market is labor vouchers or certificates that represent exactly how much work we have done, minus the deductions or basically taxes that we contribute to broader society, and we all vote on what those taxes are going to be. We take those vouchers and exchange them for goods and services, but when we use them, the vouchers disappear and can't be reinvested in the circuit of capital or accumulated, so there is no capital. This is communism. However, in the first phase of communism, the principle is still from each according to their ability, to each according to their ability. This is what could be called meritocracy done right. You get what you worked for. But since this is meritocracy done right, it's totally different than capitalism, right? In capitalism, despite calling itself a meritocracy, there really is no meritocracy because the capitalist class leeches some of the value that their workers created. So workers can't ever get the full value of their labor. In this phase of communism, the workers do get the full value of their labor, except for the deductions or taxes that we've all democratically agreed to reinvest in the community. Finally, in higher phase communism, we have reached such a high level of automation that we have truly overcome scarcity, and so there is no need for markets, states, classes, money, labor vouchers, or capital. And we can all live according to the principle, from each according to ability, to each according to need. Everyone contributes what they can and receives enough to meet their needs as a right. This is the end of meritocracy, even meritocracy done right. Okay, now let's examine how Marx's formulation has been changed by Lenin. Basically, Lenin kept the general spirit of Marx, but with some terminological distinctions changed. Lenin called the first phase of communism socialism, and the higher phase of communism just communism. He said the goal of socialism is communism. This is a Leninist invention. But this opened the door to an even further distortion of Marxism, where many people called the USSR and other experiments socialist, when really they were transitional periods to socialism. And even though the transitional governments they knew that they were called themselves socialist, that's not because they made it to socialism. They called themselves socialist because socialism was their goal, which they knew they hadn't achieved yet, and in fact they never did, at least as Marx or Lenin understood socialism. This is also where people got the idea that communism is a more extreme version of socialism. It comes sort of from Lenin, as if Stalin's gulags were communism and Lenin's party was just socialist. It's all such a distortion that it's kind of hardly worth going into. So how did Marx and Engels distinguish between communism and socialism? Well, in some ways they use the terms interchangeably, but in other ways they use the term communism to distinguish themselves from a variety of other anti-capitalists like Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, and Saint-Simon. In 1888, Engels wrote, "Yet when it, the Communist Manifesto, was written, we could not have called it a socialist manifesto." In 1847, socialism was a middle-class movement, communism a working-class movement. Socialism was, on the continent at least, respectable. Communism was the very opposite. And as our notion from the very beginning was that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself, there could be no doubt as to which of the two names we must take. Moreover, we have ever since been far from repudiating it. So even though Marx never described socialism as the path to communism, already in at least Engels' work, you can find the idea that communism is a more radical version of socialism, which Lenin really picked up on and expanded. Okay, so while we're getting even clearer about the dictatorship of the proletariat, the transitional phase, the first place to look in the manifesto for a detailed description of the policies that such a phase would enact is the 10-point plan. The authors give us a 10-point plan for the proletarian-dominated state to institute before we can move on to the first phase of communism. This list should be seen as a policy proposal in the 1800s, not a timeless suggestion across all places and times, but there is a lot of insight here, so it's worth understanding in its context as a historically situated document, not unlike the rest of the manifesto. Okay, let's go through it point for point. Number 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purpose. This point calls for the end of private ownership of land and the nationalization of all land. Although we use the word nationalization here, but maybe we shouldn't. Whenever we talk about nationalization, what we should really be thinking about is control by the whole community together democratically, right? Because the word nationalization seems to imply territorially bounded nation states, and we're really trying to move beyond that. So let's just keep that in mind whenever we use the word nationalization. The goal was to end feudalistic and capitalist land ownership structures and to utilize all rents and revenues from land for the benefit of society as a whole, not just the landowner class. Marx and Engels later on drew a distinction between large landowners whose property could be seized and small landowners whose property would not be seized. You can well imagine that they saw a big difference between owning your house for you and your family versus owning a massive apartment complex in which 100 people pay you rent even though you don't do any work except hire the odd plumber here and there. Okay, number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. We could tax billionaires out of existence and end extreme inequality with a progressive income tax, a tax that gets higher the more money you have, and therefore the easier it is to pay that tax. Number 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. Okay, given that Marx himself was dependent on inheritance money for most of his life, we should contextualize this with a speech he made for the Working Man's Association on the rights of inheritance. In that speech, he explains that the main point of inheritance is to ensure your children are safe and well off. But in communist society, everyone's basic needs are guaranteed as a right, so there's no need for an inheritance because that would stratify wealth based not on merit but on familial ties, which was a major problem in Marx's time under feudalism, as it is today in some ways. Personally, I take the opposite view, which is that there's nothing wrong with passing something down to your kids as a gift as long as everyone else in society has their needs met as a right. I'm going to pause there and I just leave that question open to you to make up your own mind. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. This was a measure the French Jacobins had taken with success. They confiscated property from those that rebelled against them or tried to leave. I think we can see this for what it is, which is a specific point in preparation for a violent revolution and civil war that they anticipated in this particular historical circumstance. The targets here are those who flee the country or who support a counter-revolution. Okay, that's what it is. Number 5 is the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Marx wanted to end private banking and create a national bank for the whole people. Personally, I think even today we should be looking at the nationalization of banks. This is a point he took from Proudhon. However, whereas Proudhon envisioned a national bank coming into existence within a capitalist society, Marx saw it as a part of a revolutionary government modeled on the French Jacobins in 1789. Okay, number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. I often imagine what life could be like if the internet, cell phone networks, and most public transportation were nationalized and insured to everyone for free at the point of use. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Marx and Engels are proposing the nationalization of key industries here, specifically coal mines and oil fields. This is an idea that should be more popular today, given that nationalizing fossil fuel companies for the purpose of decarbonization is probably the fastest way to avert the climate crisis, rivaled only by decentralized ownership of these resources. Anyway, additionally, in the place of subsidizing massive private agricultural corporations, which is what we do now, we should nationalize key industries and make them as green as possible. Marx talks about soil fertility, which was a massive problem back then and continues to be today, and we can broaden this problem to sort of encompass the urgency of the whole climate crisis. Nationalization would really help in this regard. 8. Equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. This point is saying that 1, people should contribute what they are able to contribute, so no privileged classes who don't have to work. The second thing this point means is that the state should employ people to work, especially in agriculture. This was done during FDR's New Deal with great success after Marx's death. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all distinctions between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. Marx noticed that capitalism artificially corralled and forced people into city life. This point calls for the integration of agriculture and industry to eliminate the divide between rural and urban areas. The aim is to achieve a more balanced distribution of the population and resources across the country. While this point is controversial, he is clearly advocating for an environmentally integrated, green, sprawl type of growth where we can all enjoy a connection to nature and a lifestyle close to nature. 10. Free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. They wanted free education, the end of child labor, which capitalism was and is happy to take advantage of today, and even education to be practical and geared toward real life and one's ability to contribute to society. Okay, so the question is, how relevant is this plan today? How relevant was it even at the end of Marx's life? We have one major clue from their joint preface to the manifesto, written over 2 decades later. They write, "However much the state of things may have altered during the last 25 years, the general principles laid down in this manifesto are, on the whole, as correct today as ever. Here and there, some detail might be improved. The practical application of the principles will depend, as the manifesto itself states, everywhere and at all times, on the historical conditions that exist at the time, and for that reason, no special stress is laid on the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of Section 2. That passage would, in many respects, be very differently worded today. In view of the gigantic strides of modern industry in the last 25 years and of the accompanying improved and extended party organization of the working class, in view of the practical experience gained first in the February Revolution and then still more in the Paris Commune, where the proletariat for the first time held political power for 2 whole months, this program has in some details become antiquated. One thing especially was proved by the Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." They are quoting themselves from their piece about the Paris Commune. And it's the Paris Commune that was the primary historical event that impacted their ideas. It was the first successful proletarian revolution in the world, and it indicated that such a centralized vision that the authors of the manifesto laid out in the 10-point plan may not be necessary. Maybe a more decentralized approach could be undertaken with success despite the Commune's eventual failure. So let's return to the Marx quote that supports the strictest centralization. Engels walked this statement back significantly when he wrote a footnote in the 1885 edition of the same text. I'm not going to read the whole paragraph for you because it's long, complex, and arduous, but I'll explain what it means and you can have a read carefully for yourself if you like. Before I do, I just want to lay out the stakes of this later correction. What's at stake is how much of an anarchist or how much of a statist Marx really was. Okay, so it was mainly the experience of the Paris Commune that allowed Marx and Engels to reconsider their support of strict centralization. But also, it was a re-examination of the 1793 French Revolution a century before, which had been erroneously portrayed by liberal and Bonapartist falsifiers of history who made it seem like the French revolutionary administration was centralized in a top-down way. But in actual fact, after better histories were written in Marx and Engels' time, it became clear that the whole revolutionary administration, which was successful and seen as necessary for revolution, was actually not as top-down as it seemed. It was, in fact, quite democratic. So democratic that when Napoleon came to power, he had to shut it all down. So, long story short, it became clear to Marx and Engels that a revolution was perfectly capable of being performed in a decentralized or at least a democratic way. This historical revision was doubly confirmed by the Paris Commune, which clearly and evidently was a revolution that was more or less decentralized. So Marx says the workers can't simply lay hold of the old state machinery, and Engels reiterates this. He called for the shattering of the former state power and its replacement by a new and truly democratic one. But what kind of states was Engels talking about here? Was he referring to the monarchy? After all, France was a monarchy at the time of the revolutionary Paris Commune, and it was this monarchy that he was referring to in this piece. Or was he extending his critique to the very few democratic republics at that time, which would be the Americas and Switzerland? That's about it. But the answer, I think, is both. In monarchies, this machinery included the monarchy itself, aristocratic privileges, and often the church's influence. In republics, it included parliaments, police, standing militaries, bureaucracies, and legal systems that, despite being nominally democratic, were structured to serve capitalist interests and maintain the status quo. The Paris Commune did all this. It established a dictatorship of the proletariat that was, for the most part, decentralized. But Marx called for centralization when he laid out the 10-point plan. So how do we know the Commune is a good example of the proletarian dictatorship? The answer is because Engels explicitly said so. He said, "Do you want to know what the dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat." So what did the real-world proletarian dictatorship look like? Let's read. All France would be organized into self-working and self-governing communes, the standing army replaced by the popular militias, the army of state parasites removed, the clerical hierarchy displaced by the schoolmaster, the state judge transformed into communal organs, the suffrage for the national representation not a matter of sleight of hand for an all-powerful government, but the deliberate expression of organized communes. The state functions reduced to a few functions for general national purposes. Okay, thank you for going through the basics of revolutionary Marxism with me. Please join the discussion board and share your questions and comments. I'd love to learn and grow with you. So let's continue next time with an exploration of the opposite of revolutionary Marxism, which we can call evolutionary Marxism. Stay tuned for lesson 5 in this unit on the manifesto.